Imagine being accused of stealing a loaf of bread, and your punishment is to hold a red-hot iron in your bare hand, while everyone watches in silence. If your skin blistered, you were guilty. If it didn't, they said God had spared you. This wasn't a scene from a horror story. It was daily justice in the Middle Ages. A world where pain was proof, fire was divine, and the line between sin and superstition vanished into smoke. Picture yourself standing in a small medieval village. The air smells of smoke, tallow, and wet earth. Roosters crow, children chase stray dogs, and somewhere down the muddy road, a bell tolls for morning mass. Justice here isn't written in books. It's whispered between neighbors. People don't trust words. They trust signs from God. So when someone is accused of theft, blasphemy, or witchcraft, they don't ask what happened. They ask what God decides. And that's where the punishment begins. One of the oldest and strangest systems of justice was called trial by ordeal. It wasn't about evidence. It was about faith. Blind, terrifying faith. A man might be ordered to plunge his arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If his skin healed cleanly within 3 days, he was innocent. If not, the verdict was divine. In another version, a woman accused of adultery might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for several paces. Again, her burns were judged not by doctors, but by priests, who decided whether heaven had spoken. It sounds barbaric now, but to medieval minds it was logical. If God ruled all, then surely he'd protect the innocent from harm, right? But what happened when God stayed silent? Let's move to 13th century Germany, where a punishment called the hot plowshare test awaited suspected liars and thieves. Imagine standing before a crowd, nobles, monks, peasants, as 3 red-hot plow blades glowed on the ground before you. You were told to walk across them, barefoot. If your feet didn't blister, you were free. Few ever were. Even so, these ordeals weren't about cruelty for its own sake. They were performances, rituals, meant to reassure society that order existed, that sin had a shape, and punishment could purify. Over time, though, as the church grew uneasy with these bloody divine tests, new punishments took their place, ones that felt less supernatural, but somehow even more disturbing. They called it justice. We might call it theater. By the late Middle Ages, public humiliation had become an art form. If you stole bread, cheated, or insulted your neighbor, you might find yourself wearing what was known as the shame mask. Imagine a heavy iron contraption shaped like an animal's face. A pig, a donkey, sometimes a devil, locked over your head. It was loud, cold, and impossible to remove. The mouth might even contain spikes that pressed against your tongue to stop you from speaking. You were then paraded through town for everyone to see. Children jeered, neighbors spat, and the sound of laughter echoed through the square. Other towns used the pillory, a wooden frame that clamped your head and hands in place, forcing you to stand still as passers-by mocked or threw food at you. These punishments weren't meant to kill. They were meant to expose. In a world without social media, public shame was the medieval version of going viral. But not everyone who entered the square came out alive. Some collapsed from exhaustion or from stones thrown a little too hard. Humiliation, it turned out, could be fatal. And yet, compared to what came next, this was mercy. Now, picture this. A wooden gibbet stands at the edge of town, silhouetted against a grey sky. Inside hangs the body of a criminal, not buried, not burned, but displayed in a cage of iron. This was called gibbeting, and it was meant to serve as a warning. Sometimes the condemned was already dead when placed inside. Other times they weren't. The cage might sway in the wind for days. Birds pecked, rain fell, and villagers passing by would whisper prayers, not for the victim, but for themselves. It was believed that such a sight could purify the soul of a town, that by seeing evil punished, people might turn away from sin. But punishment didn't always stop with death. In some places, criminals were exhumed and punished again, their corpses dug up, hanged, or burned to complete their sentence. The Middle Ages were obsessed with the idea that sin left residue, and that residue had to be burned away. It's chilling, isn't it? That even in death, there was no escape. By the 15th century, punishment had become mechanized, a blend of metalwork and imagination that turned fear into spectacle. One such device was the cucking stool, used mostly for scolds, women accused of gossiping too much or defying their husbands. Picture a wooden chair mounted on a long beam, perched over a river or pond. The accused woman would be strapped in, jeered at, then dunked repeatedly into the water. Sometimes she survived. Sometimes she didn't. Another was the drunkard's cloak, a barrel with holes cut for arms and head. A drunk or disorderly man would be forced to wear it and wander the streets while people laughed. The irony? The punishment itself often caused dehydration and collapse. Then there was the heretic's fork. It wasn't a fork for eating. It was a short metal rod with 2 prongs on each end. It was strapped between the chest and chin, so that if the wearer nodded or slept, the spikes pierced their throat and sternum. A reminder: repentance never rests. And yet, even these horrors weren't always about cruelty alone. They were about control. The church, the crown, the community, all reinforcing the same message. Order is sacred. Disobedience must be seen. But there was one punishment that captured this obsession more perfectly than any other, and it didn't spill a drop of blood. Deep inside medieval castles, there were rooms built not for torture, but for silence. One of them was the oubliette, from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. Imagine a narrow bottle-shaped pit carved into stone. No light, no sound, no ladder. Prisoners were lowered in and simply left. They weren't beaten, they weren't burned, they were erased. Days turned to weeks, then silence. Sometimes the oubliette was sealed permanently, the body entombed within the castle walls. It wasn't death by violence, it was death by absence. And somehow that's harder to imagine. What's fascinating is that many medieval nobles saw the oubliette as a clean punishment. No blood, no scandal. You simply vanished, and order remained untouched. But the deeper truth was this: in medieval times, to be forgotten was the worst punishment of all. If you could time travel to the Middle Ages and watch one of these punishments unfold, you might be struck by the crowd, because that was the point. There was always a crowd. Public punishment was communal. It wasn't just about pain, it was about performance. Children watched. Priests blessed. Merchants sold food at the edge of the square. It was morality turned into spectacle, what some historians call the theater of pain. But here's the paradox. While medieval punishments seem barbaric to us, they were often considered merciful compared to what came before. In the chaos of early medieval Europe, vengeance ruled. A crime could start a blood feud lasting generations. By turning punishment into law, even cruel law, society found stability, a kind of order built on fear, and for many that was enough. Still, behind every sentence there were questions left unanswered. Who decided what counted as justice? Who got to watch? And who got to walk away? By the 13th and 14th centuries, reason began to creep into law. Scholars studied Roman legal texts. The church grew uneasy with superstition. Trials by ordeal were banned. Written testimony replaced boiling water and iron. Yet the memory of those punishments lingered, etched into the collective imagination of Europe. Even centuries later, artists painted scenes of iron masks and dunking chairs, not as warnings, but as curiosities. Proof that humanity could invent infinite ways to make itself afraid. And maybe that's what makes these stories so compelling today, because beneath every bizarre law and brutal custom, there's a reflection, a distorted mirror of ourselves. We still believe in punishment. We still crave justice. Only the stage has changed. So what do these forgotten punishments tell us about life in the Middle Ages? That it wasn't just an age of darkness. It was an age of meaning. People truly believed that every wound, every humiliation, every drop of pain had purpose. To live then was to accept that suffering wasn't random. It was divine mathematics, and if you survived, it meant you'd been judged worthy. Today, those iron cages have rusted away. The masks are gone, the stones are silent. But if you walk through the ruins of an old European town at dusk, you might still feel it. A faint echo of chains, a whisper of judgment, and the haunting truth that justice, in any age, is never as simple as it seems.